The Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, is the largest mixed martial arts promotion company in the world, which hosts all of the top-ranked fighters in the sport and produces events worldwide. Based in the United States, the UFC has 9 weight divisions and enforces the unified rules of mixed martial arts. The UFC has held over 250 events. Dana White serves as the president of the UFC while brothers Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta control the UFC's parent company, Zuffa, LLC. The first UFC event was held on November 12, 1993, in Denver, Colorado. The purpose of the event was to identify the most effective martial art in a real fight between competitors of different fighting disciplines, including boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Sambo, wrestling, Muay Thai, karate, Judo, and other styles. In subsequent competitions, fighters began adopting effective techniques from more than one discipline, which indirectly helped create an entirely separate style of fighting known as present-day mixed martial arts. With a TV deal and expansion into Canada, Europe, Australia, the Middle East, Asia and new markets within the United States, the UFC, as of 2011, has gained in popularity, along with greater mainstream media coverage. As of 2011, viewers can access UFC programming on pay-per-view television in the US, Brazil, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Italy. UFC programming can also be found on Fox, Fox Sports 1 and Fox Sports 2 in the US, on BT Sport, in the United Kingdom and Ireland, as well as in 150 countries and 22 different languages worldwide. UFC programming is shown in 130 countries worldwide, and the UFC plans to continue expanding internationally, running shows regularly in Canada, Brazil, and the UK, with an office established in the UK aimed to expand their European audience. The UFC has also bought and absorbed rival promotions Pride, World Extreme Cage Fighting, as well as Strikeforce and Elite-esque. Early competition. Early 1990s. Royce Gracie used Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the early years of UFC to defeat opponents of greater size and strength. Art Davie proposed to John Milius and Rorion Gracie an 8-man single elimination tournament called War of the Worlds. The tournament was inspired by the Gracie's in action video series produced by the Gracie family of Brazil, which featured Gracie Jiu-Jitsu students defeating martial arts masters of various disciplines such as karate, kung fu, and kickboxing. The tournament would feature martial artists from different disciplines facing each other in no-holds-barred combat to determine the best martial art, and would aim to replicate the excitement of the matches Davie had seen on the videos. John Milius, a noted film director and screenwriter, as well as a Gracie student, agreed to act as the event's creative director. Davie drafted the business plan, and 28 investors contributed the initial capital to start WOW Promotions with the intent to develop the tournament into a television franchise. In 1993, WOW Promotions sought a television partner and approached pay-per-view producers TVKO, HBO, Set, Showtime, and Campbell McLaren at the Semaphore Entertainment Group, SEG. Both TVKO and Set declined, but SEG, a pioneer in pay-per-view television which had produced such offbeat events as a gender tennis match between Jimmy Connors and Martina Navratilova, became WOW's partner in May 1993. SEG contacted video and film art director Jason Cusson to design the trademarked octagon, a signature piece for the event. Cusson remained the production designer through UFC 27. SEG devised the name for the show as the Ultimate Fighting Championship. WOW Promotions and SEG produced the first event, later called UFC 1, at McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado on November 12, 1993. Art Davie functioned as the show's booker and matchmaker. The show proposed to find an answer for sports fans' questions such as, can a wrestler beat a boxer? As with most martial arts at the time, fighters typically had skills in just one discipline, and had little experience against opponents with different skills. The television broadcast featured kickboxers Patrick Smith and Kevin Rozier, Savate fighter Gerard Gordeau, karate expert Zane Frazier, shoot fighter Ken Shamrock, sumo wrestler Taylor Tooley, boxer Arch Emerson, and 175 pounds, 79 kilograms, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt Royce Gracie, younger brother of UFC co-founder Rorion, whom Rorion handpicked to represent his family in the competition. Royce Gracie's submission skills proved the most effective in the inaugural tournament, earning him the first ever UFC tournament championship, after submitting Emerson, Shamrock, and Gordeau in succession. The show proved extremely successful with 86,592 television subscribers on pay-per-view. However, the promoters did not intend for the event to become a precursor to a series. That show was only supposed to be a one-off, eventual UFC president Dana White said. It did so well on pay-per-view they decided to do another, and another. Never in a million years did these guys think they were creating a sport. With no weight classes, fighters often face significantly larger or taller opponents. Keith the Giant Killer Hackney faced Emmanuel Yarborough at UFC 3 with a 9 and 23 centimeters height and 400 pounds, 180 kilograms, weight disadvantage. Many martial artists believe that technique could overcome these size disadvantages, and that a skilled fighter could use an opponent's size and strength against him. With a 175 pounds, 79 kilograms, Royce Gracie winning 3 of the first 4 events, the UFC quickly proved that size does not always determine the outcome of the fight. During this early part of the organization, the UFC would showcase a bevy of different styles and fighters. Aside from the aforementioned Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, and Patrick Smith, the competitions also featured competitors such as Hall of Famer Dan Severn, Marco Ruiz, Gary Goodridge, Don Frye, Kimo Leopoldo, Oleg Doktorov, and Tank Cabot. Although the first events were dominated by Jiu-Jitsu, other fighting styles became successful, first wrestling, then ground and pound, kickboxing, boxing, and dirty boxing, which eventually melded into modern mixed martial arts. In April 1995, following UFC 5 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Davey and Gracie sold their interest in the franchise to SEG and disbanded WOW Promotions. Davey continued with SEG as the show's booker and matchmaker, as well as the commissioner of Ultimate Fighting, until December 1997. Emergence of stricter rules. Although UFC used the tagline "There are no rules," in the early 1990s, the UFC did in fact operate with limited rules. It banned biting and eye gouging, and frowned on, but allowed, techniques such as hair pulling, headbutting, groin strikes and fish hooking. In fact, in a UFC 4 qualifying match, competitors Jason Farron and Guy Mesger agreed not to pull hair, as they both wore ponytails tied back for the match. Additionally, that same event saw a matchup between Keith Hackney and Joe Son, in which Hackney unleashed a series of groin shots against Son while on the ground. The UFC had a reputation, especially in the early days, as an extremely violent event, as evidenced by a disclaimer in the beginning of the UFC 5 broadcast which warned audiences of the violent nature of the sport. UFC 5 also introduced the first singles match, a rematch from the inaugural UFC featuring 3-time champion Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, called the Super Fight. This proved an important development because singles matches would feature fighters who suffered no prior damage from a previous fight in the same event, unlike tournament matches. Singles matches would become a staple in the UFC for years to come. The Super Fight began as a non-tournament match that would determine the first reigning UFC champion for tournament winners to face. It later evolved into a match that could feature either title matches or non-title matches. The Super Fight would eventually completely phase out tournament matches. By UFC Brazil, the UFC abandoned the tournament format for an entire card of singles matches, aside from a one-time UFC Japan tournament featuring Japanese fighters. UFC 6 was the first event to feature the crowning of the first non-tournament UFC champion, Ken Shamrock. Controversy and reform. Late 1990s. Before reform, Senator John McCain prominently opposed the UFC. Senator John McCain, R. Arizona, saw a tape of the first UFC events and immediately found it abhorrent. McCain himself led a campaign to ban UFC, calling it human cockfighting, and sending letters to the governors of all 50 U.S. states asking them to ban the event. 36 states enacted laws that banned no-hold-barred fighting, including New York, which enacted the ban on the eve of UFC 12, forcing a relocation of the event to Dothan, Alabama. The UFC continued to air on DirecTV PPV, though its audience remained minuscule compared to the larger cable pay-per-view platforms of the era. In response to the criticism, the UFC increased cooperation with state athletic commissions and redesigned its rules to remove the less palatable elements of fights, while retaining the core elements of striking and grappling. UFC 12 saw the introduction of weight classes and the banning of fish hooking. For UFC 14, gloves became mandatory, while kicks to the head of a downed opponent were banned. UFC 15 saw limitations on hair pulling and the banning of strikes to the back of the neck and headbutting, small joint manipulations, and groin strikes. With 5-minute rounds introduced at UFC 21, the UFC gradually rebranded itself as a sport rather than a spectacle. Led by UFC Commissioner Jeff Blatnick and referee John McCarthy, the UFC continued to work with state athletic commissions. Blatnick, McCarthy, and matchmaker Joe Silva created a manual of policies, procedures, codes of conduct and rules to help in getting the UFC sanctioned by the athletic commissions, many of which exist to this day. Blatnick and McCarthy traveled around the country, educating regulators, and changing perceptions about a sport that was thought to be bloodthirsty and inhumane. By April 2000, their movement had clearly made an impact. California was set to become the first state in the U.S. to sign off on a set of codified rules that governed MMA. Soon after, New Jersey adopted the language. As the UFC continued to work with the athletic commissions, events took place in smaller U.S. markets, including Iowa, Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming, and Alabama. SEG could not secure home video releases for UFC 23 through UFC 29, with other mixed martial arts promotions working towards U.S. sanctioning. The International Fighting Championships, IFC, secured the first U.S.-sanctioned mixed martial arts event, which occurred in New Jersey on September 30, 2000. Just 2 months later, the UFC held its first sanctioned event, UFC 28, under the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board's unified rules. As the UFC's rules started to evolve, so too did its field of competitors. Notable UFC fighters to emerge in this era include Hall of Famers Mark Coleman, Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes, and Tito Ortiz, as well as notables Peter Belfort, Marker, Pedro Rizzo, Murilo Bustamante, Pat Miletich, Frank Shamrock, Mikey Burnett, Jeremy Horn, Pete Williams, Jens Pulver, Evan Tanner, Andrei Arlovsky, and Wanderlei Silva, among others. The Zuffa era. Early 2000s. Zuffa LLC bought UFC in 2000. After the long battle to secure sanctioning, SEG stood on the brink of bankruptcy when Station Casinos executives Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta and their business partner Dana White approached them in 2000 with an offer to purchase the UFC. A month later, in January 2001, the Fertittas bought the UFC for $2 million and created Zuffa, LLC, as the parent entity controlling the UFC. I had my attorneys tell me that I was crazy, because I wasn't buying anything. I was paying $2 million, and they were saying, "What are you getting?" Lorenzo Fertitta revealed to Fighters Only magazine, recalling the lack of assets he acquired in the purchase. And I said, "What you don't understand is I'm getting the most valuable thing that I could possibly have, which is those 3 letters, UFC. That is what's going to make this thing work. Everybody knows that brand, whether they like it or they don't like it. they react to it. With ties to the Nevada State Athletic Commission, Lorenzo Fertitta was a former member of the NSAC. Zuffa secured sanctioning in Nevada in 2001. Shortly thereafter, the UFC returned to pay-per-view cable television with UFC 33 featuring 3 championship bouts. Struggle for survival and turnaround. The UFC slowly but steadily rose in popularity after the Zuffa purchase, due partly to greater advertising, corporate sponsorship, the return to cable pay-per-view, and subsequent home video and DVD releases. With larger live gates at casino venues like the Trump Taj Mahal and the MGM Grand Garden Arena, the UFC secured its first television deal with Fox Sports Net. The Best Damn Sports Show period aired the first mixed martial arts match on American cable television in June 2002, as well as the main event showcasing Chuck Liddell vs. Vitor Belfort at UFC 37.5. Later, FSN would air highlight shows from their UFC, featuring 1-hour blocks of their UFC's greatest bouts. Hall of Famer Ken Shamrock was instrumental in their UFC's turnaround into a mainstream sport. UFC 40 proved to be the most critical event to date in the Zuffa era. The event sold out the MGM Grand Arena and sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys, a rate over 3 times larger than the previous Zuffa events. The event featured a card headlined by a highly anticipated championship grudge match between then current UFC light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz and former UFC superfight champion Ken Shamrock, who had previously defected to professional wrestling in the WWE before returning to MMA. It was the first time the UFC hit such a high mark since being forced underground in 1997. UFC 40 also garnered mainstream attention from massive media outlets such as ESPN and USA Today, something that was unfathomable for mixed martial arts at that point in time. Many have suggested that the success of UFC 40 and the anticipation for Ortiz vs. Shamrock saved the UFC from bankruptcy. The buy rates of the previous Zuffa shows averaged a mere 45,000 buys per event, and the company was suffering deep monetary losses. The success of UFC 40 provided a glimmer of hope for the UFC and kept alive the hope that mixed martial arts could become big. Longtime UFC referee Big John McCarthy said that he felt UFC 40 was the turning point in whether or not the sport of MMA would survive in America. When that show, UFC 40, happened, I honestly felt like it was going to make it. Throughout the years, things were happening, and everything always looked bleak. It always looked like, this is it, this is going to be the last time. This is going to be the last year. But, when I was standing in the octagon at UFC 40, I remember standing there before the Ortiz/Shamrock fight, and looking around. The energy of that fight, it was phenomenal, and it was the first time I honestly said, it's going to make it. Big John McCarthy. Despite the success of UFC 40, the UFC was still experiencing financial deficits. By 2004, Zuffa had $34 million of losses since they purchased the UFC. Fighters who came into prominence after Zuffa's takeover include Anderson Silva, Georges St. Pierre, Rich Franklin, BJ Penn, Sean Sherk, Matt Serra, Rico Rodriguez, Robbie Lawler, Frank Mir, Caro Parisian, and Nick Diaz. The Ultimate Fighter and mainstream emergence. Faced with the prospect of folding, the UFC stepped outside the bounds of pay-per-view and made a foray into television. After being featured in a reality television series, American Casino, and seeing how well the series worked as a promotion vehicle, the Fertitta brothers developed the idea of their UFC having its own reality series. Logo of The Ultimate Fighter. Their idea, The Ultimate Fighter, TUF, a reality television show featuring up-and-coming MMA fighters in competition for a 6-figure UFC contract, with fighters eliminated from competition via exhibition mixed martial arts matches, was pitched to several networks, each one rejecting the idea outright. Not until they approached Spike TV with an offer to pay the $10 million production costs themselves did they find an outlet. In January 2005, Spike TV launched TUF in the time slot following WWE Raw. The show became an instant success, culminating with a notable season finale brawl featuring finalists Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonnar going toe-to-toe for the right to earn the six-figure contract, an event that Dana White credits for saving the UFC. On the heels of the Griffin/Bonnar finale, a second season of The Ultimate Fighter launched in August 2005, and two more seasons appeared in 2006. Spike and the UFC continued to create and air new seasons until the show moved to FX in 2012. Following the success of The Ultimate Fighter, Spike also picked up UFC Unleashed, an hour-long weekly show featuring select fights from previous events. Spike also signed on to broadcast live UFC Fight Night, a series of fight events debuting in August 2005, and countdown specials to promote upcoming UFC pay-per-view cards. After a very successful run on Spike, and with the upcoming announcement of their UFC's new relationship with Fox, Spike officials made a statement regarding the end of their partnership with their UFC. The Ultimate Fighter Season 14 in September will be our last. Our 6-year partnership with the UFC has been incredibly beneficial in building both our brands, and we wish them all the best in the future. With the announcement of UFC's partnership with Fox in August 2011, The Ultimate Fighter, which entered its 14th season in that September, has moved to the FX network and air on Friday night starting with Season 15 in the spring of 2012. The new format took the show in a completely different direction, which included fighters being on The Ultimate Fighter for 13 weeks total, with each elimination fight airing live on FX on Friday nights. Surging popularity and growth mid-2000s. New York City Times Square ad for UFC 88, breakthrough featuring Chuck Liddell vs. Rashad Evans. With increased visibility, the UFC's pay-per-view buy numbers exploded. UFC 52, the first event after the first season of The Ultimate Fighter featuring eventual UFC Hall of Famer Chuck the Iceman Liddell avenging his defeat to fellow eventual Hall of Famer Randy Couture, drew a pay-per-view audience of 300,000. Doubling its previous benchmark of 150,000 set at UFC 40. Following the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, the UFC's much-hyped rubber match between Liddell and Couture drew an estimated 410,000 pay-per-view buys at UFC 57. For the rest of 2006, pay-per-view buy rates continued to skyrocket, with 620,000 buys for UFC 60, Hughes vs. Gracie featuring Royce Gracie's first UFC fight in 11 years, and 775,000 buys for UFC 61 featuring the highly anticipated rematch between Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz, the coaches of The Ultimate Fighter 3. The organization hit a milestone with UFC 66, pitting Ortiz in a rematch against Liddell, with over 1 million buys. The surge in popularity prompted the UFC to beef up its executive team. In March 2006, the UFC announced that it had hired Mark Ratner, former executive director of the Nevada Athletic Commission, as vice president of regulatory affairs. Ratner, once an ally of Senator McCain's campaign against no-holds-barred fighting, became a catalyst for the emergence of sanctioned mixed martial arts in the United States. Ratner continues to educate numerous athletic commissions to help raise the UFC's media profile in an attempt to legalize mixed martial arts in jurisdictions inside and outside the United States that have yet to sanction the sport. In December 2006, Zuffa acquired the Northern California-based promotion World Extreme Cage Fighting, WEC, in order to stop the International Fight League, IFL, from making a deal with Versus, now NBC Sports Network. At the time, the UFC had an exclusive deal with Spike, so the purchase of the WEC allowed Zuffa to block the IFL from Versus without violating their contract. The WEC showcased lighter weight classes in MMA, whereas the UFC featured heavier weight classes. Notable WEC fighters included Uriah Faber, Jamie Varner, Carlos Condit, Ben Henderson, Donald Cerrone, Anthony Pettis, Eddie Wineland, Miguel Angel Torres, Mike Thomas Brown, Leonard Garcia, Brian Bowles, Dominic Cruz, and Jose Aldo. In December 2006, Zuffa also acquired their crosstown, Las Vegas rival World Fighting Alliance, WFA. In acquiring the WFA, they acquired the contracts of notable fighters including Quinton Jackson, Lyoto Machida, and Martin Kampmann. The sport's popularity was also noticed by the sports betting community, as BoticLife.com, an online gambling site, stated in July 2007 that in 2007 UFC would surpass boxing for the first time in terms of betting revenues. In fact, the UFC had already broken the pay-per-view industry's all-time records for a single year of business, generating over $222,766,000 in revenue in 2006, surpassing both WWE and boxing. Dead Link. The UFC continued its rapid rise from near obscurity, with Roger Huerta gracing the cover of Sports Illustrated and Chuck Liddell on the front of ESPN the magazine in May 2007. Pride acquisition and integration. A fight between Fedor Emelianenko and Mark Coleman in the Japanese ring-based Pride organization. On March 27, 2007, the UFC and their Japan-based rival the Pride Fighting Championships announced an agreement in which the majority owners of the UFC, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, would purchase the Pride brand. Initial intentions were for both organizations to be run separately, but aligned together with plans to co-promote cards featuring the champions and top contenders from both organizations. However, after purchasing Pride, Dana White felt that the Pride model was not sustainable, and the organization would likely fold, with many former Pride fighters such as Antonio Rodrigo Minotauro Nogueira, Mauricio Shogun Rua, Dan Henderson, Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic, Wanderlei Silva, and others already being realigned under the UFC brand. On October 4, 2007, Pride Worldwide closed its Japanese office, laying off 20 people who were working there since the closing of its parent company Dream Stage Entertainment, DSE. On June 18, 2008, Lorenzo Fertitta accommodated the UFC's growth by announcing his resignation from Station Casinos in order to devote his energies to the international business development of Zuffa, particularly the UFC. The move proved to be pivotal, as Fertitta helped strike TV deals in China, France, Mexico, and Germany, as well as open alternative revenue streams with a new UFC video game and UFC action figures, among other projects. Fighters exposed to the UFC audience, or who became prominent in the post-Pride era, include Anderson Silva, John Fitch, Lyoto Machida, Cain Velasquez, and John Jones, among others. UFC 100 late 2000s present. Popularity took another major surge in 2009, with UFC 100 and the 10 events preceding it, including UFC 90, 91, 92, 94, and 98. UFC 100 was a massive success, garnering 1.7 million buys under the drawing power of former NCAA wrestling champion and current WWE superstar Brock Lesnar, and his rematch with former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir, Canadian superstar Georges St. Pierre going head-to-head with Brazilian knockout artist Thiago Alves, and Pride legend Dan Henderson opposing British middleweight Michael Bisping. Rival coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, United States vs. United Kingdom. UFC 100 was unique in that it drew significant interest from ESPN, which provided extensive coverage of the event in the days preceding and following it. In fact, ESPN would eventually devote additional coverage of their UFC and other MMA news, with the television debut of MMA Live on ESPN2 in May 2010. The buzz from UFC 100 was hampered significantly in the second half of 2009, after a rash of injuries and other health-related issues, including Brock Lesnar's life-threatening bout with diverticulitis, forcing the organization to continuously scramble and reshuffle its lineup for several events. However, the momentum gradually began to pick up in the first quarter of 2010, after victories from defending champions Georges St. Pierre and Anderson Silva, as well as Lyoto Makida's first career defeat to Shogun Rua for the UFC light heavyweight title. These fights segged into a very popular clash between former UFC champions and rivals Rashad Evans and Quinton Jackson, rival coaches on The Ultimate Fighter 10 heavyweights at UFC 114, featuring the UFC's first main event headlined by African-American fighters. The event scored over 1 million pay-per-view buys as Evans secured a unanimous decision victory. UFC 129 shattered previous North American gate and attendance records. This momentum carried into the summer of 2010 at UFC 116. Which featured the return of Brock Lesnar defending his UFC heavyweight title against the undefeated interim champion Shane Carwin, before 1.25 million PPV viewers. Lesnar survived an early barrage of Carwin's punches in a contest that was nearly stopped by referee Josh Rosenthal. However, Lesnar recovered in the second round to submit Carwin via arm triangle choke to retain the undisputed UFC heavyweight championship. The event as a whole was critically acclaimed in the media for living up to the hype, with a number of exciting fights that were featured on the televised card. After a dramatic fifth-round, last-minute victory by UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva over Chael Sonnen at UFC 117, Lesnar finally surrendered his belt to the undefeated Cain Velasquez via first-round TKO at UFC 121. The fight produced Velasquez's 8th knockout or technical knockout in his first 9 MMA fights. UFC 129 featured Georges St. Pierre vs. Jake Shields at the Rogers Centre in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and is currently the largest UFC event in North American history, which coincided with a 2-day UFC Fan Expo at the Direct Energy Centre. The event sold out 55,000 tickets for gate revenues exceeding $11 million, shattering previous MMA attendance and gate records in North America. TRT. On February 27, 2014, the Nevada State Athletic Commission banned the use of testosterone replacement therapy, TRT. The UFC followed suit and banned the use of TRT for any of their events, including international markets, where the UFC oversees regulatory efforts. WEC merger. Zuffa, the parent company of the UFC, purchased World Extreme Cage Fighting in late 2006 and held the first WEC event under new ownership on January 20, 2007. Soon thereafter, the WEC made its home on the Versus Network, with its first event debuting on Versus in June 2007. On October 28, 2010, Zuffa announced that its sister promotion, WEC, would merge with the UFC. The WEC held its final card on December 16, 2010. As a result of the merger, the UFC absorbed WEC's bantamweight, featherweight, and lightweight weight divisions and their respective fighters. The UFC also made the last WEC featherweight and bantamweight champions, Jose Aldo and Dominic Cruz respectively, the inaugural UFC champions of their new weight divisions 87. Reed Harris, who started World Extreme Cage Fighting with Scott Adams, had mixed emotions on the merger. It's kind of like when your kid goes off to college. At first you're not happy, but after you think about it for a while, you're really happy, Harris told MoreWeekly.com in an exclusive interview immediately following the announcement. At the end of the day, I never imagined this thing would be where we're at today. I'm extremely proud and happy that I was involved with something that will now be part of what may be, someday, the largest sports organization in the world. Strikeforce purchase. The Strikeforce cage. On March 12, 2011, Dana White revealed that Zuffa had purchased Strikeforce. White went on to explain that Strikeforce will operate as an independent promotion and that Scott Coker will continue to run the promotion. Strikeforce CEO Scott Coker announced the return of Fedor Emelianenko on an unspecified July or August event, and said, that Zufone Company would continue to co-promote with M1 Global. Following the purchase, the UFC signed many of Strikeforce's top stars and champions, such as Andrew Fox, Jason Miller, Nick Diaz, Dan Henderson, Alistair Overeem, and Kung Lee. Under Zuf's ownership, Strikeforce made minor changes, including adopting their unified rules of mixed martial arts in full, closing the promotion's men's weight classes below lightweight, and ceasing promotion of amateur undercard bouts. After an extension was reached to continue Strikeforce through 2012, the promotion's heavyweight division, sans heavyweight Grand Prix finalists, was merged into the UFC, and the promotion's Challengers Series was ended. The final Strikeforce show was Strikeforce Marquardt vs. Safedine on January 12, 2013, after which the promotion was dissolved, and all fighter contracts were either ended or absorbed into the UFC. Fox partnership. UFC on Fox Nielsen ratings event day trading share viewers ref. Velasquez vs. Dos Santos November 12, 2011 3.155 5.7 million. Evans vs. Davis January 28, 2012 2.654 4.7 million. Diaz vs. Miller May 5, 2012 1.532 2.4 million. Shogun vs. Vera August 4, 2012 1.432 2.4 million. Henderson vs. Diaz December 8, 2012 2.554 4.4 million. Johnson vs. Dodson January 26, 2013 2.454 4.2 million. Henderson vs. Melendez April 20, 2013 2.243 3.7 million. Johnson vs. Moraga July 27, 2013 1.532 2.4 million. Johnson vs. Benavidez the 2nd of December 14, 2013 1.832 2.8 million. Henderson vs. Thompson January 25, 2014 1.933 3.2 million. Werdum vs. Brown April 19, 2014 1.632 2.5 million. On August 18, 2011, the Ultimate Fighting Championship and Fox announced a 7-year broadcast deal through the Fox Sports subsidiary, effectively ending their UFC Spike TV and vs. Now NBC Sports Network partnership. The deal includes 4 events on the main Fox network, 32 live Friday night fights per year on their cable network FX, 24 events following the Ultimate Fighter reality show, and 6 separate fight night events. The promotion's first broadcast television event, UFC on Fox, Velasquez vs. Dos Santos, broke form by showcasing only one fight to television viewers. In the main event, Junior Dos Santos abruptly dethroned the undefeated UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez by knockout at 104 in the first round. The telecast peaked with 8.8 million viewers tuning into the fight, with an average audience of 5.7 million, making it by far the most watched MMA event of all time, and the most watched combat sports event since 2003's HBO bout between Lennox Lewis and Vitaly Klitschko. The Ultimate Fighter changed formats, and now be live and air on Friday nights on FX, clarification needed, followed by a live fight card. Many of the preliminary fights before UFC pay-per-views and UFC Unleashed programming will be on Fuel TV. Additional programming begins in January, including live fights, pre-shows and post-shows, countdown shows, UFC Ultimate Insider, UFC Unleashed, UFC Primetime, UFC Knockout Series, Best of Pride, and weigh-in specials. One of the other programming opportunities that is already in motion is a weekly UFC magazine-style show. When asked about the potential for a weekly magazine-style series, UFC CEO Lorenzo Fertitta responded, "Not only weekly, but, potentially, multiple times per week you'll have a UFC magazine show." The UFC will maintain production control of its product, including the use of its broadcast team of Mike Goldberg and Joe Rogan. Fox Sports will produce the pre- and post-shows. Women's MMA. Ronda Rousey is the first female UFC champion. On November 16, 2012, the eve of UFC 154, St. Pierre vs. Condit, Dana White confirmed with Jen Rome their UFC will feature women's MMA, with the signing of its first female fighter, Strikeforce bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey. She subsequently became the first female UFC champion, the first Olympic medalist with a UFC title, and the first woman to defend a UFC title. On December 11, 2013, the UFC picked up the contracts of 11 female fighters to fill up their 115-pound division. The strawweights will take part in the 20th season of The Ultimate Fighter. The season winner will be the first UFC women's strawweight champion. Some of the fighters include Felice Herrig, Claudia Gadelha, Takia Torres, Beck Hyatt, Joanne Calderwood, and even Invicta FC strawweight champion Carla Esparza, and many more. International expansion. In addition to the UFC PPV and the Ultimate Fighter events in the United States, UFC events have been held in 12 other countries. Puerto Rico, a United States territory, hosts UFC 6 in 1995. UFC Japan, Ultimate Japan was held in 1997, followed by UFC 23, Ultimate Japan 2 in 1999, UFC 25, Ultimate Japan 3, and UFC 29 in 2000. The promotion returned in 2012 with UFC 144, followed by UFC on Fuel TV, Silva vs. Stan in 2013. UFC Brazil, Ultimate Brazil was held in Sao Paulo in 1998. The promotion returned to Brazil in 2011 for UFC 134 and has hosted a total 12 events. UFC 38 was held in London, United Kingdom, in 2002. UFC returned to the United Kingdom in 2007 with UFC 70 and has held a total 14 events there. UFC 93 was held in Ireland in 2009 as well. UFC has visited Canada 14 times, starting with UFC 83 in 2008. 5 UFC events have been held in Australia, beginning with UFC 110 in 2010. UFC 99 was held in Germany in 2009, and UFC 122 in 2010. UFC on Fuel TV, Gustafsson vs. Silva was held in Sweden in 2012, featuring local fighter Alexander Gustafsson, and UFC on Fuel TV, Masasi vs. Latifi in 2013. UFC 112 was held in the United Arab Emirates in 2010, UFC on Fuel TV, Franklin vs. Lee in China in 2012, and UFC Fight Night, Safedine vs. Lim in Singapore in 2014. Most recently, UFC Fight Night, Kim vs. Hathaway was held in Macau, China, in 2014. The Ultimate Fighter has had international editions as well: Brazil, since 2012, China, since 2013, and Canada vs. Australia in 2014. On September 16, 2012, CEO Lorenzo Fertitta announced that the UFC would be expanding the Ultimate Fighter to India for the Ring international expansion. Because of mixed martial arts' relatively unknown status within India, and its population of 1.2 billion, Fertitta claimed that India would be a viable market to expand the UFC brand, however challenging. The UFC struck a deal with Sony 6 to produce the episodes, and subsequently air them as well. Currently, filming is set to begin during the summer of 2013, and air later that fall. Additional events are planned for Brazil, Australia, China, Europe, and the Middle East from 2014. Rules. The current rules for the Ultimate Fighting Championship were originally established by the New Jersey Athletic Control Board. The set of unified rules of mixed martial arts that New Jersey established has been adopted in other states that regulate mixed martial arts, including Nevada, Louisiana, and California. These rules are also used by many other promotions within the United States, becoming mandatory for those states that have adopted the rules, and so have become the standard de facto set of rules for professional mixed martial arts across the country. Rounds. UFC matches vary in maximum length, depending on whether the match is for a championship title or is a fight card's main event fight. In all fights, each round can be no longer than 5 minutes. Championship fights last for a maximum of 5 rounds. Beginning with UFC 138 on November 5, 2011, non-championship main event fights, i.e. the final fight on the card, will also last for a maximum of 5 rounds. Non-main event bouts last for a maximum of 3 rounds. UFC on FX, Alves vs. Campman featured the organization's first 2 flyweight fights as part of its first flyweight tournament, which consists of bouts that, in the event of a draw, go to a 4th sudden victory round held to determine the winner, who advances. There is a 1-minute rest period between rounds. Weight divisions. The UFC currently uses 8 different weight classes. Weight class name: upper limit in pounds, lb, in kilograms, kg, in stones, st. Flyweight 125 56.78 st 13 pounds. Bantamweight 135 61.29 st 9 pounds. Featherweight 145 65.8 10 st 5 pounds. Lightweight 155 70.3 11 st 1 pound. Welterweight 170 77.1 st 2 pounds. Middleweight 185 83.9 13 st 3 pounds. Light heavyweight 205 93.0 14 st 6 pounds. Heavyweight 265 120.2 18 st 13 pounds. Super heavyweight, unlimited, 265 pounds, plus. Strawweight, 115 pounds. Cage. Shot of the octagon from UFC 131, Junior Dos Santos vs. Shane Carwin. The UFC stages bouts in an 8-sided enclosure officially named the octagon. Originally, SEG trademarked the concept as well as the term, and prevented other mixed martial arts promotions from using the same type of cage, but in 2001 Zuffa gave permission for other promotions to use octagonal cages, reasoning that the young sport needed uniformity to continue to win official sanctioning. Today Zuffa reserves exclusive use of the name the octagon. The UFC cage is an octagonal structure with walls of metal chain link fence coated with black vinyl, and a diameter of 32 feet, 9.8 m, allowing 30 feet, 9.1 m, of space from point to point. The fence is 5 feet 6 into 5 feet 8 in height. The cage sits atop the platform, raising it 4 feet, 1.2 m, from the ground. It has foam padding around the top of the fence and between each of the 8 sections. It also has 2 entry-exit gates, opposite each other. The mat, painted with sponsorship logos and art, is replaced for each event. Attire. All competitors must fight in approved shorts, without shoes. Shirts, except in the women's division, GIS, or long pants, including GI pants, are not allowed. Fighters must use approved lightweight open-fingered gloves that include at least 1 of padding around the knuckles, 110 to 170 g/4 to 6 ounces, that allow fingers to grab. These gloves enable fighters to punch with less risk of an injured or broken hand, while retaining the ability to grab and grapple. A mouthguard and jockstrap with protective cup are also required, and fighters are checked for these by a state athletic committee official before being allowed to enter the cage/ring. Originally the attire for UFC was very open if controlled at all. Many fighters still chose to wear tight-fitting shorts or boxing-type trunks, while others wore long pants or singlets. Several wore wrestling shoes. Multi-time tournament champion Royce Gracie wore Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu GI in all his early appearances in UFC, while Art Emerson appeared in UFC 1 wearing 1 standard boxing glove. As of UFC 133 there has been a ban on Speedo-style shorts after Dennis Hallman wore one in his fight against Brian Ebersole. UFC President Dana White was so furious about the fighter's choice of attire that he awarded an honorary getting those horrifying shorts off TV as soon as possible bonus to Ebersol for finishing the fight in the first round, and in following post-fight interviews made it clear that Speedo-style shorts will no longer be tolerated. Match outcome. Matches may end via submission. A fighter clearly taps the mat, or his opponent verbally submits, or clearly communicates being in pain, such as by yelling, to a degree that causes the referee to stop the fight. Also, a technical submission may be called when a fighter either loses consciousness or is on the verge of serious injury while in a hold. Knockout. A fighter is put into a state of unconsciousness resulting from an illegal strike. Technical knockout. TKO. If the referee decides a fighter cannot continue, the fight is ruled as a technical knockout. Technical knockouts can be classified into 3 categories. Referee stoppage. The referee ends the fight because one fighter is deemed unable to intelligently defend himself. Doctor stoppage. A ringside doctor decides that it is unsafe for one fighter to continue the bout due to excessive bleeding or physical injuries. Corner stoppage. A fighter's cornerman signals defeat for their own fighter. Judge's decision. Depending on scoring, a match may end as unanimous decision. All 3 judges score a win for fighter A. Majority decision. 2 judges score a win for fighter A. 1 judge scores a draw. Split decision. 2 judges score a win for fighter A. 1 judge scores a win for fighter B. Technical decision. A fighter is rendered unable to continue as a result of an unintentional illegal element or move, resulting in a decision based on the finished and unfinished rounds, if the number of rounds to be judged is sufficient. Unanimous draw. All 3 judges score a draw. Majority draw. 2 judges score a draw, 1 judge scoring a win. Split draw. 1 judge scores a win for fighter A, 1 judge scores a win for fighter B, and 1 judge scores a draw. Technical draw. The bout ends in a manner similar to that of a technical decision, with the judges' scores resulting in a draw. Disqualification. A fighter intentionally executes an illegal move that is considered by the referee or opponent to be injurious or significant enough to negatively alter the opponent's performance should the fight continue, resulting in the opponent's victory. Forfeit. A fighter fails to compete or intentionally and prematurely ends the bout for a reason besides injury, resulting in the opponent's victory. No contest. A fighter is rendered unable to continue or compete effectively as a result of an unintentional illegal element or move, and there is not a sufficient number of finished rounds to be judged to make a technical decision viable, or both fighters are rendered unable to continue or compete effectively. Also, a fight may be ruled a no contest if the original outcome of the bout is changed due to unsatisfactory or illegal circumstances, such as a premature stoppage, or fighters testing positive for banned substances. In the event of a draw, it is not necessary that the fighter's total points be equal, e.g., UFC 41 Penn vs. Suno, or UFC 43 Freeman vs. White. However, in a unanimous or split draw, each fighter does score an equal number of win judgments from the 3 judges, 0 or 1, respectively. Judging criteria. The 10-point must system is in effect for all UFC fights. 3 judges score each round, and the winner of each receives 10 points, while the loser receives 9 points, or fewer, although 10 rounds are given in the rare event that a judge feels the rounds was too close to warrant giving one fighter 10, and the other 9. Scores of 10-8 are typically awarded for dominant rounds, and anything more dominant is scored less. 10-7 rounds are very rare. Fouls. The Nevada State Athletic Commission currently lists the following as fouls. 1. Biting. 2. Eye gouging. 3. Fish hooking. 4. Groin attacks. 5. Small joint manipulation. 6. Hair pulling. 7. Headbutting. 8. Putting a finger into any orifice, or into any cut or laceration, on an opponent, See fish hooking. 9. Striking to the spine or the back of the head, see rabbit punch. 10. Striking downward using the point of the elbow, see elbow strike. 11. Throat strikes of any kind, including, without limitation, grabbing the trachea. 12. Clawing, pinching, or twisting the flesh. 13. Grabbing the clavicle. 14. Intentionally attempting to break an opponent's bone. 15. Kicking the head of a grounded opponent. 16. Kneeing the head of a grounded opponent. 17. Stomping a grounded opponent. 18. Kicking to the kidney with the heel. 19. Spiking an opponent to the canvas on his head or neck, see pile driver. 20. Throwing an opponent out of the ring or fenced area. 21. Holding the shorts or gloves of an opponent. 22. Spitting at an opponent. 23. Engaging in unsportsmanlike conduct that causes an injury to an opponent. 24. Holding the ropes or the fence. 25. Using abusive language in the ring or fenced area. 26. Attacking an opponent on or during the break. 27. Attacking an opponent who is under the care of the referee. 28. Attacking an opponent after the bell horn has sounded the end of a round. 29. Flagrantly disregarding the instructions of the referee. 30. Timidity, including, without limitation, avoiding contact with an opponent, intentionally or consistently dropping the mouthpiece, or faking an injury. 31. Interference by the corner. When a foul is charged, the referee in their discretion may deduct one or more points as a penalty. If a foul incapacitates a fighter, then the match may end in a disqualification, if the foul was intentional, or a no contest, if unintentional. If a foul causes a fighter to be unable to continue later in the bout, it ends with a technical decision win to the injured fighter, if the injured fighter is ahead on points, otherwise it is a technical draw. Match conduct. After a verbal warning, the referee can stop the fighters and stand them up if they reach a stalemate on the ground, where neither are in a dominant position or working towards one. This rule is codified in Nevada as the stand-up rule. If the referee pauses the match, it is resumed with the fighters in their prior positions. Grabbing the cage brings a verbal warning, followed by an attempt by the referee to release the grab by pulling on the grabbing hand. If that attempt fails, or if the fighter continues to hold the cage, the referee may charge a foul. Early UFC events disregarded verbal sparring/trash talking during matches. Under unified rules, antics are permitted before events to add to excitement and allow fighters to express themselves, but abusive language during combat is prohibited. Evolution of the rules. UFC 1. Although the advertising said, "There are no rules," there were in fact some rules: no biting, no eye gouging, and no groin attacks. Fights ended only in the event of a knockout, submission, or the corner throwing in the towel. Despite this, the first match in UFC 1 was won by referee stoppage, even though it was not officially recognized as such at the time. UFC 2. Groin attacks were unbanned. Time limits were dropped, ending the need for judges. Modifications to the cage were added. The fence became 5 feet tall, but would continually grow in height afterwards, and the floor became the canvas that is still used today. UFC 3. The referee was officially given the authority to stop a fight in case of a fighter being unable to defend himself. A fighter could not kick if he was wearing shoes. This rule would later be discarded, then changed to no kicking with shoes while on the ground, and then reinstated before finally being discarded. UFC 4. After tournament alternate Steve Jenim won UFC 3 by winning only one bout. Alternates, replacements, were required to win a pre-tournament bout to qualify for the role of an alternate. UFC 5. The organizers introduced a 30-minute time limit. UFC 5 also saw the first super fight, the one-off bout between two competitors selected by the organizers, with the winner being crowned super fight champion and having the duty of defending his title at the next UFC. UFC 6, the referee was given the authority to restart the fight. If two fighters were entangled in a position where there was a lack of action, the referee could stop the fight and restart the competitors on their feet in their own corner. In UFC 6, they officially adopted the 5-minute extension to the 30-minute rule, which had been used in UFC 5. Ultimate 1995. This event was the first to introduce the no fish hooking rule and to reinstate judges. Time limits were changed to 15 minutes in the quarterfinals, 18 minutes in the semifinals, and 27 minutes in the finals. UFC 8 time limits changed to 10 minutes in the first two rounds of the tournament, 15 minutes in the tournament final and super fight. Time limits would continually change in the later UFC events. Fights could now be decided by a judge's decision if the fight reached the end of the time limit. The panel was made up of 3 judges, who simply raised a card with the name of the fighter they considered to be the winner. In this fashion, a draw was not possible, since the only 2 possible outcomes of a decision were 3-0 or 2-1 in favor of the winner. UFC 9. To appease local authorities, closed-fisted strikes to the head were banned for this event only. The commentators were not aware of this last-minute rule that was made to prevent the cancellation of the event due to local political pressures. Referee Big John McCarthy made repeated warnings to the fighters to open a hand when this rule was violated. However, not one fighter was reprimanded. UFC 9 was also the last UFC event to feature the super fight. Ultimate 1996. This event was the first to introduce the no grabbing of the fence rule. UFC 12. The main tournament split into a heavyweight over 200 pounds and lightweight 200 pounds and under division, and the 8-man tournament ceased. Fighters now needed to win only 2 fights to win the competition. The heavyweight champion title and title bouts was introduced, replacing the super fight title, albeit matches were still for a time branded as super fights. UFC 14. The lightweight division was rebranded middleweight. The wearing of padded gloves weighing 110 to 170 g, 4 to 6 ounces, becomes mandatory. Gloves were to be approved by the UFC. Hair pulling, groin strikes and kicks to a downed opponent became illegal. UFC 15. Limits on permissible striking areas were introduced. Headbutts, elbow strikes to the back of the neck and head, and small joint manipulation became illegal. UFC 21. 5-minute rounds were introduced, with preliminary bouts consisting of 2 rounds, regular non-title bouts at 3 rounds, and title bouts at 5 rounds. The 10-point must system was introduced for scoring fights, identical to the system widely used in boxing. UFC 28. The New Jersey State Athletic Control Board sanctions its first UFC event, using the newly developed unified rules of mixed martial arts. Major changes to the UFC's rules included barring knee strikes to the head of a downed opponent, elbow strikes to the spine and neck, and punches to the back of the neck and head. Limits on permissible ring attire, stringent medical requirements, and regulatory oversight were also introduced. A new weight class system was also introduced. This new set of rules is currently the de facto standard for MMA events held in the U.S., and is still in use by the UFC. UFC 31 weight classes are realigned to the current standard. Bantamweight moves from 150 to 155 and becomes known as lightweight. Lightweight becomes known as welterweight, middleweight becomes light heavyweight, and a new middleweight class is introduced at 185 pounds. UFC 43. In the event of a stoppage, fights restart in the position the fight was stopped. UFC 94. After an incident where Georges St. Pierre was accused of putting Vaseline on his back, cornermen were disallowed from bringing Vaseline into the octagon. Lubricant may now only be applied outside the octagon before the commencement of the first round. UFC 97. Foot stomps are banned. UFC 98-foot stomps are allowed again. UFC 133 Spadal-style trunks are banned. UFC 138 first 5-round non-title main event. The Ultimate Fighter. Fights that occur on The Ultimate Fighter are classified as exhibition matches under NSAC sanctioning, and thus do not count toward the professional record of a fighter. Match outcomes also do not need to be immediately posted publicly, which allows for fight results to be unveiled as the series progresses. These exhibition matches variably have 2 or 3 rounds, depending on the rules used for each season. In most seasons, preliminary matches, before the semi-final bouts, were 2 rounds. In Season 2, all matches had 3 rounds. For 2-round matches, if there is a draw, after 2 rounds, an extra 5-minute round, sudden victory is contested. If the extra round concludes without a stoppage, the judge's decision will be based on that final round. All matches past the first round use 3 rounds, as per standard UFC bouts. During the finales for each series, the division finals have the standard 3 rounds, plus a 4th round, if the judges score a tie. UFC events. Production team: Octagon Girl Ariane Celeste. Comedian, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Taekwondo black belt Joe Rogan teams up with play-by-play announcer Mike Goldberg to provide commentary during broadcasts of nearly all UFC events. The veteran voice of the Octagon is announcer Bruce Buffer. Ariane Celeste and Brittany Palmer are Octagon girls. Each fighter is assigned a cutman by the promotion, who cares for the fighter before the fight and in between rounds. Jacob Stitch Duran is one of the best-known cutmen working for the organization. Matches are made by matchmaker and VP of Talent Relations, Joe Silva. Bert Watson is the production manager for all UFC events, including fighter weigh-ins and other public events held before fights that frequently draw crowds of fans and reporters. Fighter salaries and contracts. A UFC fighter generally does not have a salary. They are paid per fight, with amounts depending on how well known the fighters are and how well sponsored a fighter and an event is. Fighters will typically get paid money to fight with an additional bonus if they win. Cash bonuses are also awarded for Fight of the Night and Performance of the Night, formerly known as Knockout of the Night and Submission of the Night. The size of these bonuses are $50,000 USD, and, for less well-known fighters, they can be several times larger than the contracted amount for the fight. Contracted amounts generally have to be declared to the State Athletic Commission. However, the UFC also pays undisclosed locker room bonuses to fighters. In recent years, UFC fighters' contracts and merchandising rights have been the subject of dispute between fighters, represented by Growing the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association, and UFC, which has attempted to defend existing regulations. Current champions. Male division upper weight limit champion since title defenses heavyweight 265 pounds, 120.2 kilograms, 18.9 st. Cain Velasquez December 29, 2012, UFC 155, to light heavyweight 205 pounds, 93.0 kilograms, 14.6 st. John Jones March 19, 2011, UFC 128, 7 middleweight 185 pounds, 83.9 kilograms, 13.2 st. Chris Weidman July 6, 2013, UFC 162, 1 welterweight 170 pounds, 77.1 kilogram, 12.1 st. Joni Hendricks March 15, 2014, UFC 171, 0 lightweight 155 pounds, 70.3 kilograms, 11.1 st. Anthony Pettis August 31, 2013, UFC 164, 0 featherweight 145 pounds, 65.8 kilograms, 10.4 st. Jose Aldo November 20, 2010, UFC 123, 6 bantamweight 135 pounds, 61.2 kilograms, 9.6 st. TJ Dillashaw May 24, 2014, UFC 173, 0 flow weight 125 pounds, 56.7 kilograms, 8.9 st. Demetrius Johnson September 22, 2012, UFC 152, 3. Female division upper weight limit champion since title defenses bantamweight 135 pounds, 61.2 kilograms, 9.6 st. Ronda Rousey December 6, 2012, UFC on Fox 5 Conference, 3 strawweight 115 pounds, 52.2 kilograms, 8.2 st. Vacant 0. UFC Hall of Fame. Name date of induction notes Royce Gracie November 21, 2003, UFC 45. Ken Shamrock November 21, 2003, UFC 45. Dan Severn April 16, 2005, UFC 52. Randy Couture June 24, 2006, The Ultimate Fighter, Team Ortiz vs. Team Shamrock finale. Mark Coleman March 1, 2008, UFC 82. Chuck Liddell July 11, 2009, UFC 100. Charles Lewis Jr. July 11, 2009, UFC 100. Matt Hughes May 29, 2010, UFC 114. Tito Ortiz July 7, 2012, UFC 148. Forrest Griffin July 6, 2013, UFC 162. Stephan Bonnar July 6, 2013, UFC 162, B. Circumflexa, the only non-fighter inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Circumflex B, the only fighter who was not a UFC champion to be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Media. Music. UFC Ultimate Beatdowns Volume 1, an album of music featured in and inspired by the UFC. Video games. Ultimate Fighting Championship, Dreamcast, and PlayStation. UFC Tap Out, Xbox. UFC Throwdown, Nintendo GameCube, PlayStation 2. UFC Tap Out 2, Xbox. UFC Sudden Impact, PlayStation 2. UFC 2009 Undisputed, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. UFC Undisputed 2010, PlayStation Portable, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, iPod Touch, iPad, iPhone. UFC Personal Trainer, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii. UFC Undisputed 3, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360. EA Sports UFC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One. In January 2007, Zuffa and video game developer/publisher THQ announced a license agreement giving THQ worldwide rights to develop titles under the UFC brand. The agreement gives THQ exclusive rights to current and next-generation consoles as well as to PC and handheld titles. Also included are certain wireless rights which were not detailed. The licensing agreement was set to expire in 2011, although it appeared to have been extended to 2017. On June 6, 2012, during the E3 exhibition, THQ had announced that they will be giving the license of UFC Undisputed to EA. The move came about months after UFC Undisputed 3's release, which THQ felt did not make a profit for the company. UFC 4 will feature fighters from Strikeforce. Action figures. Round 5. The first UFC action figure collectibles were released by Round 5 Corporation in May 2008. Series 1 of their figures includes Quinton Rampage Jackson, Matt Hughes, Tito Ortiz, and Randy Couture. Series 2, released on November 10, 2008, includes Wanderlei Silva, Sean Sherk, Rich Franklin, and Anderson Silva. In July 2009, Round 5 acquired the UFC license through Yak Pacific, and subsequently released 5 more series under the UFC and Pride brands. 2 packs were released in August 2010, and includes a UFC Octagon cage and Pride ring display stand. Limited edition versions include fabric walkout tees or paint variations, and are limited in number with foil and holographic packaging variances. Special edition and exclusive versions have been released at various UFC Fan Expo events. Yak Pacific. On June 10, 2008, it was announced that UFC had signed an exclusive 4-year contract with Yak Pacific to create action figures for UFC. As of 2009, the schedule envisages the release of these figures in November 2009. They have currently been 8 series released, and they feature special Legends, Pride, and WEC-style figures as well. 3 2-pack series have also been released, as well as several Expo and Internet exclusives. There are also several different Octagon cage playsets that have been released, including the Octagon Playset Official Scale Octagon Playset and Electronic Reaction Octagon Playset. A Pride-style ring playset was also originally planned, however no news have been given on its status or release date since then. Yak Pacific UFC Deluxe Figure Lineups, Series Royce Gracie, Legends Packaging. Brock Lesnar, Frank Mir, Rashad Evans, Keith Jardine, Houston Alexander, Kendall Grove, and Miguel Angel Torres, WEC Packaging. Series 1, Chuck Liddell, Anderson Silva, Forrest Griffin, Michael Bisping, Evan Tanner, Legends Packaging. Kevin Randleman, Pride Packaging. Chai Congo, and Mike Swick. Series 2, Nate Marquardt, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Mike Thomas Brown, WEC Packaging. Bas Rutten, unreleased, in the series, moved to Series 6, Georges St. Pierre, unreleased, in the series, moved to Series 6, Lyoto Machida, unreleased, in the series, moved to Series 5, Quinton Jackson, unreleased, in the series, moved to Series 8, and Thiago Alves, unreleased, in the series, moved to Series 6. Series 3, Chuck Liddell, Legends Packaging. Caro Parisian, BJ Penn, John Fitch, Mark Holman, Legends Packaging. Thiago Silva, and Mauricio Rua, Pride Packaging. Series 4, Wanderlei Silva, Sean Shirk, Rich Franklin, Matt Hughes, Kimbo Slice, Jamie Varner, WEC Packaging. Don Fry, Legends Packaging. And Andrei Arlovsky, unreleased, in the series, later released in Series 7. Series 5, Lyoto Machida, 1 of 100 inserts were also released randomly and contained a special die-cast version of their UFC belt. Quinton Jackson, Pride Packaging. Matt Hamill, Dan Severn. Legends, Kenny Florian, Matt Serra, and Stephan Bonnar. Series 6, Thiago Alves, Randy Couture, unreleased, was originally supposed to be a 1 of 100 inserts that was to be released randomly and contain a special die-cast version of their UFC belt. Georges St. Pierre, Clay Guida, Frank Mir, Tito Ortiz, Jens Pulver, WEC Packaging. And Bas Rutten, Legends. Series 7, if bought at Target, each of them, except for Nogueira, also came with a replica UFC event mini poster. BJ Penn, Legends Packaging. Anderson Silva, Andrei Arlovsky, Forrest Griffin, Legends Packaging. Diego Sanchez, and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Pride Packaging. 1 of 100 inserts were also released randomly and contained a special die-cast version of the Pride belt. Series 8, Matt Hughes, Legends Packaging. Chuck Liddell, Pride Packaging. Frankie Edgar, 1 of 100 inserts were also released randomly and contained a special die-cast version of their UFC belt. Nate Diaz, and Quinton Jackson. Yak Pacific UFC Deluxe 2-packs figures lineups. Series 1, Chuck Liddell vs. Wanderlei Silva, Frank Mir vs. Brock Lesnar, Anderson Silva vs. Rich Franklin. Series 2, Lyoto Machida vs. Shogun Rua, Georges St. Pierre vs. Matt Hughes, Randy Couture vs. Chuck Liddell, was supposed to be cancelled due to copyright issues. However, only 1,000 packs managed to make it to several Kmart stores. Series 3, Chuck Liddell vs. Tito Ortiz, B. Japin vs. Kenny Florian, Dan Severn vs. Royce Gracie, Legends Packaging. Expos exclusives, Georges St. Pierre, Boston Expo 2010, 1 of 500. Ringside Collectibles Internet exclusives, Forrest Griffin vs. Stephan Bonnar, The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 Final, Dana White, Quinton Rampage Jackson 1 of 1000. DVD. Every pay-per-view UFC event has been released onto DVD. UFC 23 through UFC 29 were not released in the US on home video or DVD by SEG. They have since been released on 2 box sets which feature around 10 events each set, in chronological order. Xbox Live. UFC on Xbox Live launched on December 20, 2011. Xbox Live subscribers are able to view pay-per-view events in high definition, 720p, access a library of live and on-demand video content, connect with friends to predict fight results, and have the ability to compare fighter statistics and records. Other functions are also available. Free fights have recently been streamed for a limited time.